And one of the things that I got complimented on at one point was that I said I don't know a lot.
Produced by Podcast Architects.
You're listening to the Lead On podcast, where we discuss experiences in the armed forces while exploring lessons from military leaders.
Welcome to another edition of Lead On Lessons from Military Leaders. I'm David Deary, president of the Enlisted Leadership Foundation. And joining me today is John McGlothlin. A little bit about John, and I'm just going to read it right from his sheet here. John is a former Army paratrooper who served across U.S., Europe, in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And after beginning his career as intelligence, he attended law school at the University of Virginia, became a JAG officer, which we won't hold that against you, JAG officer in D.C., a National Guard, where he was mobilized after the insurrection attempt on January 6th of 2021. We're not going to talk about this because we're not a political podcast, so that's just part of the bio. But one of the things that I found really neat, and John will talk more about that, is the fact that he served as both an NCO, warrant officer, and a commission officer in his time of service. So, John, good to see you again, and welcome to Lead On Lessons from Military Leaders.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to discussing leadership and sharing some insights and some both struggles I've had and some things I've learned along the way from them.
Yeah, I am too. I really enjoyed the time we got to spend last week, getting to know each other and learn a little bit more about you. Before we get into the meat of the conversation, I always like to ask our guests, what's the worst piece of leadership advice someone ever gave John? Could have been before service or after service or during service.
Well, I think the worst piece of advice, leadership advice I've gotten, I actually got twice. It's the same piece of advice. It was phrased two different ways, once in the military, once afterwards. In the military, you mentioned I've been a senior NCO warrant officer, now a regular officer, part-time in the National Guard. When I became a warrant officer, I went to WOCS, Warrant Officer Candidate School. And the course is designed for mid-career professionals, but often it would treat people like basic trainees. And one of the things that I got told while I was there, and again, got told by somebody I actually respect a lot, who's a very good soldier, was that there needed to be more process, what I would call bureaucracy. At one point, I got an evaluation that said everything you were in charge of went well, but you needed to be more involved in the planning and the emails and the communication. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, if I was in charge and everything went well, why did I need to send more emails? What problem would I have been solving exactly? And I later heard that again when I was working as a Pentagon contractor, so sort of in the military, I guess. And this was during the pandemic when I was on a team that involved a lot of travel, and we couldn't travel anymore. And one of my teammates, who again, good guy, trying to look out for me, said, I'm worried about you. I think I need to see more emails from you. And I didn't say this directly, but I'm like, more emails about what? It's a pandemic. We're a travel team that can't travel anywhere. Like, I'm trying to be very attentive to answering any questions that come up and showing that I'm just as committed to the job as I was before. But I'm not sure adding more administrative tasks, we'll call them, to anyone's plate is actually going to help. So that's probably the worst piece of advice I gotten, is when people want to focus on process instead of results.
Yeah, it's such a good point. Admittedly, it's really easy to be caught up and managed through email. I've been guilty of it. I've known a lot of people that have been guilty of it. In fact, over the last few years, before the pandemic and through it, I tried to make a more concerted effort personally, just picking up a phone and just, oh my goodness, make a phone call. If you really want to mess with somebody, make a phone call without sending a text first that says, hey, are you free? But, that's a story from another time. But you're absolutely right. There's a time and a place. There's certainly some good use for emails and correspondence. But listen, if the success is there, however you did it, obviously was good. So why did you join the military in the first place?
The short answer is 9/11. At least that was the impetus for me thinking about joining the military. I'd graduated from undergrad in May of 2001, was sleeping on a buddy's couch and had planned to go into journalism, having already worked as a journalist and a speechwriter while in school. 9/11 happens, decide I want to learn Arabic, look around at where I might be able to do that, and obviously the military is one option. And the more time I spent around military folks during the decision process, the more I realized that they, as a group, really had something that I lacked, had some character traits that hadn't been developed in me, and ones I thought were important and would do me a lot of good to be around. So both the skill of learning Arabic and the more personal development I wanted to undergo both pointed me towards joining the military.
Okay, really good. So our audience knows you. John wrote a book recently called "How to Deal with Damn Near Anything," and the subtitle is "The Paratrooper's Guide in Life or to Life." So we'll talk a little bit more about the book towards the end, but much of what we will discuss, you'll probably be able to find in the book as well as some of the stories in that book. And we were talking a lot when it comes to leadership traits. I like to be able to hone in and really, tear apart, if you will, or explore certain leadership qualities. And the one thing that we kind of landed on was transparency. So, give us an example of where transparency, whether somebody wasn't transparent, because oftentimes I think oftentimes we invest in a certain leadership trait because of how something negative happened to us, how somebody maybe wasn't very transparent, or even I wasn't transparent in a situation that I failed at. And I learned, man, if I would have been a little bit more transparent here, a little bit more open, it could have avoided some of these tumultuous issues. So, what made you land upon transparency?
What made me land on transparency was it was one of the things I identified as being the biggest difference between leadership in the military and leadership elsewhere. And in the military, we spend so much time around each other that it is a lot more difficult to present a carefully curated version of yourself to other people. And whereas in the civilian world, sometimes even people that you work with, you may see them occasionally, if even supervisors, depending on how your team or your workplace is structured, you may not see your boss that often even. So it's a lot easier to decide to put a lot of effort into presenting yourself a certain way. It is a lot easier to divert that effort into trying to just be that way. And to the extent that's not possible, to the extent you're trying to work on something, it's best to be transparent about the fact that that's still a work in progress. And one of the things that I got complimented on at one point was that I said, I don't know a lot, which sounds like a funny thing to be complimented on. And part of it is knowing if you're in a position where you need to know, you may not have the flexibility to say, I don't know all the time. So you have to be aware of your circumstances. But in this circumstance, I was around a lot of headstrong people. I could be a bit headstrong myself. And it was seen as a virtue that I was willing to say, I didn't know how this thing worked. Can you tell me how it works? Rather than choosing not to be transparent about where I was at and putting myself in a position to fail later when people overestimated how much knowledge I had about a particular thing.
Yeah, fake it till you make it, right?
Exactly, which is it's okay sometimes, but you gotta pick and choose. And a lot of times people, understandably, they feel the pressure. They want to be seen as knowledgeable. They want to be seen as an expert. But you gotta be careful about where you decide to puff your chest out or show your feathers, and where you decide to admit that you're still learning.
Well, number one, we're always still learning, right? I think when a leader is resigned to the fact that there's nothing more to be learned, well, it's time to maybe change jobs. But I can remember, man, way back when I was a E6 in the Navy, and we had this young junior officer, O1 or O2, check on board the ship as our division officer, and he stood every watch and radio with us. And he came in to learn our jobs. And his feeling, he says, listen, I don't know what I'm supposed to advocate for you on. When I get asked by the department head, I need to be a little bit more intelligent and understanding what you do. I don't know. And he earned so much respect from us that he was willing to say, I don't know. And fast forward, when I was a Command Master Chief, when you enter the Command Master Chief program, there's an interview process that takes place. And I used to tell the candidates that I would talk to, I say, it's okay to say, I don't know. Very seldom do those snap decisions need to happen right away. And more often than not, it's going to be better to say, I don't know, but I can get back to you in a couple hours or in a day based on the situation to give the best, most accurate answer. Because I found that when I did take a swag, I'm always going back and updating it or correcting, and I lose a little bit of stock. What other people, I'll just add one more little comment and then turn it back over to you. But a lot of people, non-military, and I think this is important to recognize, they don't understand that a vast majority of what we do is in a training environment. And in this training environment, when we're preparing for when that balloon goes up and we have to go do what we're training for, we don't have to make those snap decisions. That's, in a training environment, you have the time to make the best, most accurate decision, so that when it's real life and you have to make that quick decision, well, you've got some experience, you know how to assess it, you know how to take everything in.
Well, it's one of the core reasons I wrote the book, honestly, was I didn't realize, when you're in the military, virtually everyone around you's in it too. So you don't necessarily have a lot to contrast it with. And I got out, and after a few years of being out full-time, still being in part-time, but living as a normal civilian the vast majority of the time, I realized that ethos of training and improvement was what really set the military apart. And I understand that most of the books and movies that are made about the military focus on combat. I get that. I went to both Iraq and Afghanistan. I was on 100, 200 something patrols. I understand why those stories get told, and they should always be told. But there's other stories, like you mentioned, that are about training. And they don't make for dramatic movies, and that's fine. I'm not saying that anyone should start taking Tom Cruise out of his airplane and start sticking him in a classroom.
Don't do that.
No, I don't think that would work for anybody. But in book form, maybe it's a little more approachable for people to learn more about how that culture of development can benefit people who don't go anywhere near and aren't interested in going anywhere near the military.
And I just think you make a couple comments, culture. We could talk about humility by saying, I don't know. All parts of being transparent, right? I mean, transparency so affects the culture of an organization. And that organization could be as big as whatever business you're at today, to as big as the 2 or 3 people that you're supervising, because it has an effect overall. And to be a humble servant leader, there's so much to be gained by transparency, because it touches so many other leadership touch points, especially those leadership touch points that the leadership gurus often say they're great qualities to possess.
I try to encourage people, briefly before we move on,
Yeah.
trust the authority of your position. That you don't need to come in and convince everybody you're in charge. Just understand that the default setting, if you're a leader, is that you're in charge. And you don't need to act like that authority needs to be reaffirmed every 30 seconds. It comes off as needy, it comes off as power hungry. Instead, trust that people understand that you're in charge and that you don't have to push too hard. Now, if somebody's being insubordinate or there's other types of problems, you may need to push harder than you do otherwise. But your default setting can't and shouldn't be, everybody look at how in charge I am, or you're going to burn people out and you're not going to be able to be transparent with them because you feel like you have to keep up this facade of absolute power.
Oh, so true. Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. So was there any leader in your life that part of the significance or the impact that they had on you was their transparency?
At the end of the day, all roads lead back to a man named Scorpion King. Not his legal name, although it probably could have been. But legal name, as far as I know, Drill Sergeant Smith, my basic training senior drill sergeant. And at one point, he left during the middle of our training cycle. And we went from seeing him all the time to not seeing him at all. And we weren't really sure why, because as basic trainees, we're not entitled to a lot of information about the HR status of our cadre. And we were told at one point he had gotten in a motorcycle accident, been hit by a car, and he came back and he spent the rest of his time in basic training with us walking with this giant walking stick. The man was too tough for crutches. It just wouldn't have matched the vibe. So he came back with this giant walking stick and talked to us about what had happened. And he was everything you could ask for out of a drill sergeant. He was not, I'm sure he has a favorite restaurant or a favorite movie. I don't know any of his normal personality traits, and I hope I never find them out, because he was mythic. But he still took the time, instead of just ignoring the fact he'd been gone, to sit down with us and talk with us, not at length, and didn't get deep into his feelings, but to be willing to talk to us as people who he respected, even if we were people he was still in charge of. And you can show respect like that without giving up your authority. And he was willing to do that by being transparent about what had happened and why he was gone. And it allowed us to anything, it deepened our respect for him, because he was coming from a place where he felt confident enough to share those details with us instead of just keeping us in our little basic trainee box and not telling us anything about the world outside of what we had to do 5 seconds from now.
Oh yeah, again, being transparent, sharing your woes, and you never know. A leader doesn't know how their transparency is going to impact in a positive nature on trust and whether somebody could trust them. Now, I guess you could also go too far being transparent, right? You can, overshare, or hey, I'm a funny guy, and start telling jokes and things like that, which could have a negative effect on the trust and the respect aspect. I mean, if there's no respect, there won't be their trust. And how many times have we heard in our military career, I don't have to like you, I just have to respect you. I don't have to like you as a person, but I'll respect you on your rank. Well, translate that, I don't trust you. I will give you the bare minimum. Have you ever experienced any oversharing events or wrote about anything in your book?
Yeah, unfortunately, the military can be tough on domestic relationships, and and I understand when that bleeds over into work. I've seen it happen. I was single the whole time I was full-time Army. I'm married now, so I didn't have to juggle that. But I certainly have much respect for everybody who does. So if that's not going well for you, your coworkers may not be the people who need to know that in any detail. Sometimes if something's personal, one very oblique reference is plenty. Just say, it's been kind of a rough week at home, or just something like that, and that's it. You've got to, self-awareness is king when it comes to that kind of thing, and avoiding oversharing. Just one little drop to give people the idea that you're going through some things is plenty. So you're right that oversharing is transparency doesn't mean translucency. It doesn't mean being so flimsy in the walls you set up that everybody gets to see everything. It just means letting in enough light at the right times to round out how you deal with people as a leader. But no, people should and this is where self-awareness is key. Tap your peers on the shoulder and say, hey, I'm going through a rough time right now. Maybe you got a medical thing. Maybe you got a family thing. Keep an eye on me. Let me know if you think if it's affecting my work. Pick somebody you trust, because it's going to be hard if you're already going through something to monitor yourself in the moment like that. You need other people to help you. You need other people to be transparent with you about how you're doing. And that if you can cultivate that culture of respectful honesty, then you can get the feedback you need from peers so that you're also dialing the right level when it comes to both managing up and downwards.
Great point. So, one thing that I love about those of us that wear the cloth of our nation, or wore the cloth of our nation in my case, so much of these, being transparent. Listen, I think that we're way transparent in the military because we share that common bond. And when we deploy, the person to your right and your left is your family. And so you tend to be more transparent. But we get to practice how much or how little in all these other leadership traits before we transition into civilian world. So, thinking about that yourself, what was your purpose in writing this book? And is the book written like from you back to the military community to help as they transition out? Is it written to the civilian community as we transition out to help them better understand, which is always one of the big talking points with transitioning service members? Or was this just something that you've always wanted to do, and so you just knocked it out and took it off the bucket list?
It was not something I always wanted to do. I thought I was going to be the last guy when I got out full-time to write a book about the military. I just thought, hey, there's plenty of books. What do I have to add? I didn't, I had a good career. I'd like to think I did well, but I didn't do anything, I didn't kill Osama. So there was no need for me to necessarily get out there and get in front of the first TV camera that I saw. What I learned was, and what the main goal of the book is that there's the hidden side of the military that we discussed a little bit earlier that's about training and personal development. And the reason I wrote the book is when I realized how absent that is from the civilian world. And it's absent for understandable reasons. It would be a little bit awkward if a civilian job or a college tried to get in your business like the military does. The military is a different environment. But that doesn't mean you can't take lessons from that environment and apply them. So I'd say, to give you a straighter answer, it is mainly written for people in civilian life, whether that's people who have always been civilians or military folks that are headed that way. That being said, I think it would have been useful for me as a soldier to know how good I had it in terms of the number of people and the amount of resources focused on my development when I was in uniform, I probably would have valued it a bit more and maybe put more effort in than I did. So I think there's a use for it there, but it's mainly directed at folks who are either outside the military or headed outside the military.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I think there's, going back to that bond that I mentioned earlier, to be able to have a resource while we're serving, from somebody who, writing from a perspective of what we've gone through. And it doesn't matter the branch of military, it all, we may wear a different color uniform, we use, maybe use little different acronyms, but we have shared experiences and shared stories. And I do think that this book will help any currently serving as they prepare for transition, because you're writing it from that perspective as well, right? As somebody who's taking your experiences and then to value the training that we do receive. Important for the Enlisted Leadership Foundation, because we started because some of the enlisted leadership development that I received growing up in the ranks over 15 years ago, the formal schoolhouses in the Navy were actually closed down due to the war effort. And so they're slowly coming back. Different things are starting to take place. But, that's how the Enlisted Leadership Foundation started, as let's see if we can provide some enlisted leadership development to the sailors, which then exploded. And so now we have all branches of the military that attend our programs. And for that reason, I really appreciate the book and appreciate the time to have you on board and just share a little bit about your experiences, the value of being a transparent leader and how important that is. And is there ever a time in your experience, moving up through the ranks, that transparency decreases? Does it stay the same? Or do you think the higher up you go, the more it should increase? What's your experience?
I think it does decrease. And one of the things is it's inevitable. The higher up you get in the military, the more it becomes like an office job anywhere. And I'm not saying that you can take that away or that you should necessarily try to. It's okay for different echelons at an organization to have different social norms. But some of the reasons for, we'll call it forced transparency, that exist at lower levels, as you mentioned, people being in close physical space all the time, people knowing each other's moods and each other's struggles more than you would know in a civilian job. Some of those things go away as people sometimes just literally get more physical space to themselves and are able to stay in a bubble of their own creation if they want to, in a way that they couldn't indulge when they were lower ranking. I think that transparency is just as important. Now, you shouldn't, it was one of those things where the more you're like an office environment, the more you have to keep in mind that transparency that you create has to be created for a reason. You don't need to be imposing burdens on people or introducing awkward situations. You need to be able to pick the right level of transparency, but the right level is almost never zero. And avoiding awkwardness is something people should remember, but even when you reach that higher echelon, you have to make sure that you're willing to embrace temporary awkwardness in the name of longer lasting results. Now, usually that awkwardness comes in the form of honesty about professional performance, not in terms of personal stuff or struggles. But sometimes people don't want to have those small conversations about, hey, that let's take it from an office perspective. That briefing didn't go well. That memo didn't quite turn out how we hoped. It's better you tell somebody right now up front and be transparent with them than wait until it gets 3 echelons up and everybody thinks that Captain Smith or Command Master Chief Smith doesn't know what he's doing because nobody was transparent with him at a lower level because he was going to retire soon, or he's an ornery guy and nobody wants to criticize him. And there's all these little reasons that people can avoid having those moments of transparency, but it is usually, people are right to, every situation is different, but people should start from a place of trying to be transparent and honest, and then at least having a good reason not to be. Those good reasons exist, but people should beware defaulting to not doing anything.
Yeah, we could, if we had more time, we can go into counseling and how important it is to give feedback and counseling. But unfortunately,
one brief nugget then. In the book, it talks about why mentorship programs are so hard for civilian jobs. That's something that I was surprised. I thought you sign somebody a mentor, they meet occasionally, they have honest conversations. There's a whole universe of research about how mentorships in civilian jobs can be counterproductive. People are afraid to have mentors because they think if their mentor doesn't like them, they'll sabotage their career, and that can actually happen. So no, you're right to bring that up, and it is something that is discussed more at length there, and it's way more complicated than it seems to even engage in those simple sorts of training environments.
That's a great teaser. It's a motivation to go get the book. So listen, before we end, I like to close with another question. What's the luckiest leadership error or mistake you ever got away with? A bad decision that could have really gone bad, but you dodged a bullet.
So the first one that comes to mind is in Iraq, and this is not a combat story. I consciously avoid those stories in this because I want things people can relate to anywhere. Somebody said, who wants to be roommates with, we'll call him Z. Z had some issues. And I'm an NCO at the time. I'm an E6, and I'm sorry, it was E5 then. And nobody else wanted to room with the guy. And I'm like, you know what? I can't ask a junior person to do this if I'm not willing to do this. Give me the guy as a roommate. The guy, he was everything he was advertised to be in terms of being a problem. And it turned out that he got sent home for some worrying behavior. Nobody came to any harm. His military career ended probably where it should have, or slightly later. But it was a awkward environment for me, to be sure. But the reason it turned out to be a good decision or a good bad decision was not only did I get a much more up close look at what a troubled soldier looks like, and it definitely equipped me better to deal with similar situations in the future, but I didn't realize the amount of brownie points I got from everybody else for living with this guy. I thought I was just kind of doing it because somebody needed doing it. And sometimes if you just do the right thing as a leader without anybody knowing that people are paying attention, it's funny. Sometimes they're not looking as much as you think. Sometimes they're looking a lot more. And the only way to square that circle is just to try to do the right thing every time. And that way, when people are looking, they'll see what they need to see. And if they're not, oh well, they'll look next time. So yeah, living with that guy, not the best decision for my sanity necessarily in the short term, but it worked out for my development in the long term.
That's great. That's great. You've been listening to John McGlothlin, who's a writer, a professor, a lawyer, and a soldier. John's the author of a book called How to Deal with Damn Near Anything. After a military career, now he's still in the National Guard, serving our country. I'm going to offer those in the comments below on this podcast. You'll see a website, and the first 20 listeners that goes to that website and leave some feedback on this podcast, you will receive a link for a free download of John's book. So go to that podcast, give us some feedback, and receive your book so you can learn more about John, some of the leadership stuff, transparency, and other things, that chapter on mentorship, and bless somebody with it, and hopefully up level your leadership journey as well. John, I want to thank you again for your service. Thank you for joining me today. Any final word?
Thank you for having me. My enlisted time, my first about 10 years in the Army, will always be the core of my service, and honestly the core of my personality. And it's something that is deeply meaningful to me, and anything I can do to talk with or to contribute to enlisted leadership and development is the best possible use of my time and energy. So thank you for giving me the chance to do that.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you. Well, once again, this has been another edition of Lead On, Lessons from Military Leaders, hosted by the Enlisted Leadership Foundation. Tune in next time to meet our next guest. Thank you.
Produced by Podcast Architects.